So let's talk more about the concerns of women in the Caribbean. We're being joined by Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, who's the head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. Hello, Dr. Hosein, how are you?
Hello.
So we've seen an increase in the discussion of women's issues in Trinidad and Tobago in recent years. Has that increase in talk been translated into real action?
Let me give you all an example. So in the past year, a woman was killed just after Carnival. This led to a series of protests by women and the removal of a mayor from office. This Carnival, in comparison to the year before, what we saw was the police take a very clear stand and say that any unwanted touching at Carnival time is an act of assault. So what we were able to see is how women protesting, and indeed young women protesting, was not only able to remove a city official, but was able to shape the kinds of messages that police themselves were sending at this Carnival time. I would argue that putting your message out there does in fact make a difference, and that there are times when we can see that difference reflected in what the state desires and ends up protecting on behalf of women.
So I know that the Institute at UWI and also many feminist groups in Trinidad and Tobago are trying to push for a national gender policy. Could you tell me what's the result of that push, and why is a national gender policy so important?
A national gender policy has been advocated for in one form or another for 22 years. In the latest incarnation, developed since 2004, the national gender policy has gone through different versions. The challenge with that policy is the inclusion of provisions around the decriminalization of sexual orientation and around the decriminalization of abortion. There's a lot of resistance to it. Now, the thing about a national gender policy is that it's very necessary, because if you don't have one singular policy approach by the state, then what a Ministry of Education is doing could be very different from what a Ministry of Agriculture is doing, or a Ministry of Health, or a Ministry of National Security. And what connects the approaches to gender justice amongst those ministries? One gender policy. So currently the state has not articulated one politics, one vision with regard to gender justice. And we expect that a version of that long-awaited gender policy is going to be proposed by the cabinet. But we also expect that that version is not going to protect women's sexual rights or their reproductive rights. And we see that as dividing women against each other, giving some rights over others. And that is going to be a struggle that we are going to have to wage with the government, however long it takes.
But I want to go back to a comment that you just made just now in responding to me. You said that there's resistance. Why do you think that is? Resistance to implementing a national gender policy?
The resistance comes from religious groups, primarily Christian religious groups, but not only, who are trying to defend the morality of the state on terms defined by sexuality and reproduction. Our argument in the Caribbean is that Caribbean feminism is homegrown. It is rooted in the struggles that women have been waging since slavery and indentureship. And in enslavement, women were fighting for the right to decide when they had children and under what circumstances, and were practicing abortions. So this struggle is one for us that's 500 years old, just as the struggle to end sexual violence, just as the struggle for pay equity was one that women were struggling against during the indentureship involving Indian indentured workers between 1845 and 1917. The resistance that has to do with the fact that the citizen and the state is defined in ways that make a very narrow notion of morality and a very narrow notion of woman the only one allowed. And of course, the struggle for women's rights is a struggle for women to be allowed to be human as they choose, and to be valued not because they meet particular ideals, but simply because they are.
Thank you so much. We've been talking to Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. She is the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. My apologies. We're going to take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting.